So today we've got something on the docket that's, well, sort of unsettling but absolutely fascinating at the same time. Nanoplastics. They're this invisible yet ever-present part of our lives, and their potential impact on health has caught the attention of a lot of researchers lately.
Nanoplastics? Okay, I know about microplastics, those tiny little fragments in, toothpaste or the ocean. But nanoplastics, that's a new one for me. How tiny are we talking here?
Oh, they're much smaller, think microscopic, even smaller than microplastics. And what's even more concerning is they're starting to show up in our tissues, in our bloodstream, and, according to some studies, even in our organs.
Whoa, hold on. You're saying these particles are inside our bodies? Like living in there?
Yes, well, not living per se, but accumulating. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Dr. Eric Topol recently wrote a couple of fascinating articles about this. There's plastic in my plaque, and the microplastic concerns elevate too. Dr. Swanson read those articles.
Wait, the title alone? Plastic in my plaque? That's not something I ever thought I'd hear.
Right? It sounds almost surreal, but it's a real issue that he links to environmental exposure. And it's not just a standalone piece, he ties it to broader healthcare and chronic disease concerns. The articles really dig into how nanoplastics might contribute to problems like vascular and neurological dysfunction over time.
Okay, that's a heavy connection. But why now? Why is this suddenly such a big deal?
Well, a lot of this research is still emerging, but essentially, as our use of plastic has skyrocketed over the decades, so has the breakdown of these materials into smaller and smaller particles. And with more advanced testing methods, we're finally starting to understand the scope of their impact.
Got it. And I'm guessing this isn't just an out-of-sight, out-of-mind kind of problem anymore. It sounds like it's working its way into our systems in ways we've barely scratched the surface of.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so relevant, not just for environmentalists, but for healthcare practitioners, policymakers, and individuals like us. We can't separate the health of the planet from our own health. We'll unpack more about how nanoplastics are shifting global health paradigms in just a bit. And building on that, it's clear that the real paradigm shift here is understanding how global health is no longer just about fighting communicable diseases or addressing traditional concerns. These new threats, like nanoplastics, are quietly but profoundly infiltrating our systems, redefining what we need to consider when we talk about health.
And we're talking about this being, what, a structural issue? Like something foundational that needs thinking across the whole system?
Exactly, because it's foundational in the sense that these exposures are now chronic, right? Over time, they can contribute to major health burdens like vascular disease or even neurological dysfunction. And the kicker is, if we address these environmental determinants proactively, we're not only preventing disease but also reducing the future burden on healthcare systems.
Huh. Preventive healthcare, but on a much, much larger scale. That's kind of meta, honestly. But I need an example. Nanoplastics are one thing, but how does this play into actual human health costs?
Well, let's start with the preventive side. Topol discusses this idea of cost savings when you mitigate these kinds of long-term exposures. For instance, he highlights how controlling nanoplastic pollution, reducing sources, improving cleanup, could, hypothetically, lower healthcare costs tied to diseases like atherosclerosis down the line. Think about it this way. Treating systemic inflammation caused by these particles is far costlier than avoiding the exposure in the first place.
Right? Makes sense. So, less about treating big health problems after they happen and more about stopping the invisible stuff before it even starts to, snowball into those problems.
That's exactly the idea. And what's fascinating is that the solutions aren't always that expensive. In fact, many involve better environmental policies and not just changes in healthcare infrastructure. It's about creating that shared vision for health, one that's environmentally safe and cost-effective at the same time.
I'm seeing the picture now. I mean, it's like this whole ecosystem of health, where ignoring one corner, like environmental safety, kind of disrupts everything else, you know?
You've nailed it. When public health doesn't account for these emerging threats, we leave gaps. And those gaps turn into chronic diseases or, honestly, skyrocketing healthcare bills. But by looping environment into the conversation, we're tackling root causes in a way that benefits both the individual and society. Nanoplastics, these incredibly tiny plastic particles, are not just environmental pollutants, but are being detected in human tissues, including arterial plaques and even brain tissue.
Wait, brain tissue? That's insane. How does something like plastic even get to the brain?
That's exactly what researchers are trying to figure out. The leading theory is that the minuscule size of nanoplastics, combined with their chemical properties, allows them to bypass the body's natural barriers. For example, the blood-brain barrier, which is supposed to protect the brain, might not be as effective at stopping something as small as these particles.
That's honestly hard to process. I mean, what does this mean for long-term health, though? Like, are we looking at something immediate or more like slow, cumulative damage?
It's definitely more of a long-term concern. While we don't have enough evidence yet to blame nanoplastics directly for specific diseases, there are signs of systemic inflammation linked to their presence. In things like arterial plaques, there's a suspicion they might accelerate atherosclerosis, or essentially contribute to hardening of the arteries. And when you think about neurodegenerative conditions, well, even a slight increase in inflammation could have cascading effects.
So it's not like smoking, where you know it directly causes lung cancer. This is more like it might push something along faster if the conditions are, right?
Exactly. Chronic diseases are rarely caused by just one thing. It's more like a perfect storm where environmental factors like these plastics work in tandem with genetics and lifestyle to tip the scales. What makes nanoplastics particularly concerning is that we're exposed to them constantly, whether it's through food, water, or even air.
Right, so even if they're just one piece of the puzzle, it kind of feels like removing that piece could prevent a lot of unnecessary problems.
Precisely. And that's why this topic is gaining so much traction in research. If these particles are playing even a small role in systemic inflammation or neurodegeneration, addressing their presence could have enormous implications for public health.
All right, so you've made it clear why these nanoplastics are such a big deal for public health, and I can see why researchers are so focused on them. But I'm still wondering, where exactly do these nanoplastics come from? What's creating them in the first place?
Great question. So, nanoplastics are essentially a byproduct of larger plastics breaking down. Think of that water bottle you leave in the sun, or the shopping bag that gets tossed into the ocean. Over time, environmental stressors like UV rays, heat, and physical forces cause them to degrade into smaller and smaller pieces until you're left with, well, nanoplastics, microscopic fragments that are so tiny we didn't even know they existed for decades.
Huh. So these weren't even part of the original design. They're basically an accident of, like, the system?
Exactly. And here's where it gets fascinating. Their creation is what we'd call an emergent property of the system. What that means is, when you look at the life cycle of plastics, how they're produced, used, disposed of, and eventually exposed to nature, the system as a whole gives rise to new behaviors or outcomes that weren't anticipated. Nanoplastics were never part of the plan when people started making plastic products, but they're a direct result of how the system interacts over time.
Wow. So the system kind of surprises itself? That's wild, honestly.
It is, and what's even more wild is how these particles behave in the environment. Nanoplastics interact with their surroundings differently than larger debris. Things like water temperature, pH levels, and chemical composition can influence how they move through ecosystems. And then when you add biological factors like how plants or marine animals might absorb them, it creates this chaotic web of effects that scientists are still trying to untangle.
So we're not looking at a simple plastic goes here, bad stuff happens type of narrative. This is like layers of variables all stacking up?
Absolutely. That's what makes nanoplastics such a challenge and such a perfect example of complexity. The variables don't just add together, they interact in unpredictable ways. One small change, say higher temperatures due to climate change, can amplify how these particles spread or how they interact with chemicals in the environment. It's what we call nonlinear behavior in a complex system.
Right? Nonlinear meaning it's not like one-to-one, right? Like a small input might have a huge output that's hard to predict?
Exactly. And for something as tiny as nanoplastics, those unpredictable outcomes can go unnoticed for years. It's only now, with improved technologies and a greater focus on environmental science, that we're realizing the scope of their impact and grappling with how to adapt.
So it sounds like the uncertainty itself is kind of baked into the problem. How do you even begin to deal with that?
That's the tough part. Traditional approaches to assessing risks, like exposure models or toxicity studies, often struggle to capture all the variables at play. What's needed are adaptive methods that evolve as we learn more. But even then, there's no perfect roadmap, just strategies to hopefully steer the system in a better direction.
So, we've got this system where nanoplastics are spreading, interacting unpredictably, and causing all kinds of health issues. And yet, dealing with it feels like an entirely different challenge. Where do you even start to tackle something so tangled?
You're absolutely right, it's a massive challenge, and the key to tackling it lies in trans-sectoral collaboration. Essentially, we need environmental scientists, clinicians, and even policymakers working together to address the problem.
That's a pretty wide-ranging team. Where do they even start? I mean, what's step one here?
Step one is really about bringing everyone to the table with a shared vision. For instance, toxicologists can study how nanoplastics interact with the body, while epidemiologists look at population-level patterns of exposure and disease. Clinicians then use that data to improve diagnostics and treatments, and it all feeds back into policy, whether it's creating standards for reducing exposure or even regulating how we produce and manage plastics in the first place.
Okay, but what about specifics? Like you mentioned standardizing detection earlier. How does that work in practice?
Great question. Standardization is about creating consistent methods for measuring nanoplastics, whether it's in human tissues, food, or the environment. Right now, different studies often use different protocols, which makes comparing results tricky. Collaborative initiatives could set benchmarks for detection methods, making it easier to track where nanoplastics are accumulating and how much people are being exposed to.
Huh. But why does that matter so much? I mean, isn't the problem kind of obvious already?
You'd think so, but without solid standardized data, it's hard to move forward. For instance, policymakers need evidence to justify stricter regulations, and clinicians need reliable tests to understand how these particles might be linked to specific health conditions. Without that foundational work, we're just guessing.
Right? So it's like laying the groundwork before you can actually build anything else.
Exactly. And what's exciting is that some of this groundwork could lead to major breakthroughs. For example, epidemiological studies on nanoplastic exposure could transform how we approach preventative care for related chronic diseases.
So it sounds like the collaboration is what really pulls everything together. Without it, you've just got a bunch of disconnected pieces.
That's exactly the point. By uniting toxicologists, epidemiologists, and clinicians, we're taking the science from the lab, applying it to real-world health, and ultimately informing better policies. It's that bridge between the molecular level and the societal level, and it's essential if we're serious about tackling this crisis.
Collaboration certainly seems powerful for tackling the big issues. But what about individuals? I mean, when it comes to regular people, is there anything they can actually do to deal with nanoplastics? Anything they can control in their day-to-day lives?
Absolutely. Individual actions play a critical role, and a lot of this comes down to education. Public awareness campaigns can highlight practical steps people can take to reduce their exposure. For example, cutting back on single-use plastics, choosing products made from alternative materials, and supporting better waste management systems.
Got it, so use fewer plastics, pick like bamboo or glass instead, and don't throw your Starbucks cup in the street. But I mean, how much can that really move the needle, you know? Like individual actions only go so far, right?
True, individual actions alone won't solve the problem, but they do serve two important purposes. First, they lower personal exposure levels. For instance, if you store food in glass instead of plastic, you're potentially reducing the amount of micro or nanoplastics leaching into your meals. And second, it's about creating cultural momentum, setting the stage for industries and governments to adopt more sustainable practices.
So it's kind of this ripple effect. Small actions from consumers sort of push the bigger players, like corporations or policymakers, to up their game.
Exactly. And health professionals play a key part too. They can educate their patients about these risks, like advising on ways to minimize exposure, and advocate for broader changes in their communities. Think of it as a grassroots approach, but backed by science.
I like that. And it highlights the importance of scientific literacy, health communication, and trust between scientists and the public, something that's really lacking right now. But, What about industry? I mean, consumers can only swap so many straws. How do you get the companies that produce this stuff to actually change?
That's where education intersects with accountability. Public awareness campaigns targeting industries can increase pressure for change. Messaging matters here. Corporations need to see that sustainable practices aren't just good for the environment, but also good for their bottom line. If consumers demand it and policies back it up, the incentives align. Industries know they have to adapt to keep their customers and meet regulatory expectations.
Right? So it's all about building that external pressure, making better practices the obvious choice for everyone involved.
Exactly, and it works both ways. As industries shift, they make it easier for individuals to make environmentally conscious choices. It's a cycle of change that starts with awareness, and that's why education is such a foundational piece of this puzzle.
So education lays the foundation, right? It sparks awareness and pushes for change, but that's just one piece. If we're looking to tackle something as massive as nanoplastic pollution, it can't stop there. It's got to come from the top. Policies, research, big picture stuff.
Absolutely. A comprehensive response means science and policy need to work hand in hand. And honestly, this is where it gets both challenging and exciting. Dr. Eric Topol, in his article, talks about increasing funding for research that helps us understand things like long-term health effects of nanoplastics. We're talking dose-response relationships, exposure timelines, and even how nanoplastics interact with other pollutants.
Okay, pause for a second. When you say dose-response relationships, what exactly does that mean? Like, it's worse if you've got a higher dose?
Exactly. Essentially, it's understanding how much exposure causes harm and at what levels. It's crucial because this underpins how regulations are written, what limits to set for industries, or what levels are considered safe for the public.
Got it. So without that data, it's like shooting in the dark when it comes to creating rules?
Pretty much. But beyond the research, we also need bold policy intervention. Regulatory agencies have to step in, whether it's limiting plastic production, promoting biodegradable alternatives, or enforcing stricter waste management systems. Prevention is always cheaper, easier, and frankly, better than dealing with the health costs later on.
Right? Because hospitals and healthcare systems end up carrying the cost of what could have been avoided entirely with, smarter policies up front.
Exactly. And what's hopeful is that these solutions aren't necessarily pipe dreams. They're feasible, especially when you align them with science-driven strategies. It's about investing in the research that informs policy, and in turn, policies that empower and fund actionable change. It's a cycle if we do it right.
Okay, but do we have time? I mean, this problem feels massive. Can we actually tackle it before it's out of control?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's the urgency that makes this moment critical. The longer we wait, the harder it becomes. But what gives me hope is that we've seen systemic change happen before, whether it's Clean Air Acts, smoking regulations, or even global agreements to tackle ozone depletion. Momentum is key.
So basically, the blueprint exists. We just need the willpower to put it into action for nanoplastics?
Exactly. With the right combination of interdisciplinary research, innovative policies, and public support, I believe we can create a framework that reduces risks not just in the short term, but for generations to come.
Well, I've got to say, this has been eye-opening for me, and a little daunting, but honestly, super hopeful too.
That's the balance, right? Recognizing the scope of the issue, but also seeing the potential for solutions. And I think we're at a point where every small step, whether it's policy, research, or even personal choices, contributes to shaping that better, healthier future.
Well, on that note, I think we've given folks a lot to think about today. Sophia, as always, thanks for walking us through it all.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation, and I'm hopeful our listeners will feel just as motivated to engage with these challenges.
So, to everyone tuning in, thanks for joining us on It's Time. Let's keep pushing for those small steps, and hey, maybe even some big leaps towards a healthier world. We'll catch you next time.